Pozdrav, moi hrvatski prijatelji. Ja sam Stephen Fry. I'm sure I've got that completely wrong, but I just wanted to say hello to my Croatian friends and thank you for your questions, which I have in front of me here, which I'm going to ask. Firstly, Marushka asks, how did the reign of the Greek gods come to an end? The Olympomachy, if you will. That's very good. Was there an Olympomachy? That would suspect a war which deposed the gods. Well, there were wars to depose the gods. The Titans, of course, was the first war which the gods won, deposing them. And then there was the war against the giants, as I'm sure you know, Marushka, and the gods just won that with the help of Heracles. But the sad thing about the end of the gods is that they sort of just fell away. I think it's because mankind, humankind, just took on more and more confidence, became more and more godlike. After the heroes, who were mostly half gods themselves, had a god as a parent, after them came the generation that fought the Trojan War. Odysseus he had divine blood in him, but he was essentially a human being, as was Penelope, as were most of those who fought in the war. And when they got back home, they continued to build cities and farms and a culture and a civilization that they ran themselves, and they began to need the gods less, and the gods, I suppose, faded away. If you climb Olympus now, you will see no thrones, no evidence that they were ever there. It's been a long time. The wind has blown, and any sign of those gods has been blown away by that wind, the wind of time and change. But if we look inside ourselves, there's a piece of Zeus in you. There's a piece of Athena in you. There's a piece of Aphrodite. And there's a wild piece of Dionysus. The gods have gone into us. They make up everything we are. So they're still around in that sense. I hope that answers your question. What's the next one? From Gorana. Which myth or personage from Greek mythology most resonates with your own life? Well, thank you, Gorana. I hope, by the way, I'm pronouncing your names correctly. Do forgive me if I'm not. I suppose one of the aspects of Greek mythology that most appealed to me when I was a boy, and which still does, is this Greek sense of trying too hard, reaching too high. What I love is that the Greeks recognized this was a fault that could lead one plunging downwards, but it was also somehow glorious. So the two best known myths there, or perhaps the three I should say, would be Phaeton, the boy who was a son of Apollo, or in some versions Helios, the sun titan, and he begged his father to borrow the chariot that every day the sun god takes across the earth in an arc, sending light and warmth down to the earth below. And he somehow got his father to promise in the way that children can, and the father couldn't take away the promise but told him to drive it carefully. But he was completely out of control, and he went too far from the earth, which then froze and gave us the Arctic and Antarctic and Greenland, or he went too close and burned everything up and gave us the deserts. Well, that's one theory. It's a nice myth, and of course Zeus threw a thunderbolt, and he ended up burnt to a frazzle. Poor Phaeton in Italy somewhere. But that's a thing I can relate to. I think most of us can. We're desperate to try something out that we're not yet ready for. We're too young, but we really believe we can do it. I mean, it even is often a car, which is the modern equivalent of a chariot, that kids will say, I can drive, and then they make a mess of it all. And that's one form of overreaching. The other form, I suppose, is Icarus is the best known, the son of Daedalus, who gave them both wings that he'd stitched together from feathers and wax to escape from King Minos in Crete. And he warned his son not to go too near the sun, but unfortunately he did. That's an unfortunate thing in English, isn't it? That the male child is called the sun, and the thing up in the sky is the sun. But anyway, the sun flew too close to the sun, if you see what I mean. And his wax did melt and he perished. And that again is something, gosh, we all recognize that. Just try and get too hard to succeed, ignoring the warnings of others. But it's glorious and beautiful, and it's terrible. And I suppose the other one is Bellerophon, who rode the Pegasus, the horse with the wings, and got so convinced of his own heroic status that he tried to fly and land on Olympus with the horse, but Zeus threw him down, and he got horribly injured and lame for the rest of his life, and Zeus kept Pegasus. That's a less attractive one. That's sort of arrogance, hubris, as the Greeks like to call it. But I think Icarus and Phaeton I can connect with. I hope that isn't too long an answer. I must learn to be shorter with my answers. Dragan asks, which version of the myth of Pandora's jar do you prefer? The one in which hope is a comfort, or the one in which it is a punishment? That's such a good question, Dragan. I think I change in my view almost every day. For those who are less familiar than you with the story, Pandora, the first first human female created, was sent down with this jar, sometimes called a box, but actually in the original myth, a jar. And in it, she was told never to open it, but of course she couldn't help it. Her curiosity made her pull it off. And out came all the miseries of the world: hunger, lying, starvation, murder, greed, all the things that make our lives unhappy. And she slammed the lid back on, not knowing she'd kept one little fairy in there to beat its wings against the inside for all time. And that was Elpis, which is the Greek for hope. And as I say in the book, some people feel that was a terrible thing. Hope was the one aspect that we needed most. We all need to keep us going through life, for compensating for the miseries and the disadvantages that life can bring us. We need hope, don't we? Well, others, Nietzsche famously, and other philosophers too, have said that hope is the worst and most destructive thing you can have. It's like the gods laughing at you, saying you've got a chance. It's just, and then pulling it away. It's the hope that kills, as every sports fan knows. But which do I believe? I believe both, but on different days. So sometimes I think hope is a wonderful thing, a glorious thing that even if it negates reality, even if in the face of obvious truth, it tells the lie that there is going to be something good around the corner, it still makes one feel better. And then other days, I feel like hope is indeed a dishonest, a delusion, something that we must not accept. Can you hear the bells? There we are. It's 10 in the morning. So the answer is both, Dragan. Sorry. Again, I keep taking so long to answer. Sarah asks, or it might be Sarah, but it's a lovely name, whichever you are. Do you feel that your work and being open about your mental illness did anything for the destigmatization of it? Well, that's a wonderful question, and I would love to believe that I, along with many, many others who started to talk about mental health, and often at a personal level, might have been of some help. I think it's a bit like in the 1980s coming out as gay. If you were a well-known figure and you came out as being comfortable about your sexuality, then it may well have helped people who were at a different stage in their lives, who were young and maybe not growing up in the capital city, but somewhere in the countryside where attitudes were a little more old-fashioned and a little less forgiving, a little less understanding, and a little less accepting and tolerant and so on. If I help them feel better about themselves, then that's wonderful, because generations before me made me feel better about myself. They didn't come out publicly in the way that we've been able to, but they did by living lives of fulfillment and achievement, and often they were punished for their sexuality. Well, anyway, that's the sexual metaphor, the simile, and it's like that with mental health, inasmuch that here's a condition that was not talked about. There was shame attached to it. It was considered sometimes to be the fault of the person. It was almost like a crime to be unhappy, or to be so unhappy as to as to embarrass in public, as to cause scenes, exhibitionism in mania, and all kinds of different ways that you can embarrass people by your mental unhappiness and disease and disorder. And that needs to change, and I think it has. I think more people do understand now that there's so much unhappiness that is hard to estimate. But the young people harming themselves, whether through cutting themselves and causing pain in their physical bodies to try and compensate for the pain they're feeling in their minds, or whether it's actual suicide. There is a huge epidemic of mental unhappiness, and there are all kinds of people all too keen to tell us why it's so, because they have something to sell. It's either a drug or a mindfulness app or a religion or something. And in amongst that, there's good sense too, and people who genuinely have things to offer to help. But I would say to people, if you have friends and you have mental health problems, don't be afraid to tell your friends about it, and to understand that it's not your fault, and that you're not alone. So there's that, and finally Luca. What's next for me in mythological retellings? Well, actually, there's one more Greek story to tell, and that's the coming home of all the heroes from the Trojan War, particularly, of course, Odysseus, the famous Odyssey of Homer, describing the 10 years that he took to get from Troy back to Ithaca, his home island, and Penelope, his wife, and Telemachus, his son, and the extraordinary adventures he met along the way. But also there's the homecoming of Menelaus and Helen, who caused the war in the first place, of course, or at least whose abduction caused the war. Whether she was a willing participant is a whole other question. But they had interesting adventures on the way home too, as did others. Agamemnon, of course, had an extraordinary homecoming. And so, yes, and Aeneas, who went off eventually to found Rome. So there are these marvelous stories that are the last figures of the heroic and of the mythological age. After that, the Greek myth really did, to return to Mariska's question, it really did sort of just dive away into human history. The gods died, as it were. And so it's that story. I'm not sure what I'll call it. The great Greek word is nostos, which means home, your sense of home, a deep spiritual sense of home. And if you have a pain from missing it, the Greek for that is nostalgia. And that's a feeling we feel very strongly about that homesickness, if you like. Anyway, thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for your interest in my books and for your abiding interest, I hope, in Greek mythology, which is such a great story for us all. And, well, I hope soon to visit Croatia. Wouldn't that be nice? And say hello to some of you. But meanwhile, just thanks very much and all the best. Bye-bye.